Thunderhead by Mary O'Hara, Chapter 19. Next day, Rob walked briskly up the gorge towards the stables. The fact that he was in boots and whipcord breeches rather than blue jeans meant that there was riding ahead of him. He had never lost the military carriage acquired as a cadet, nor the habit of meticulous grooming. His black hair was carefully trimmed, his head carried chin up. His step had none of the drag of the farmer, nor the roll of the cowboy. It was the long, reaching tramp that covers the ground and takes possession of it, the typical West Point walk. And if, behind the keen, incessantly roving blue eyes, was ever a thought or reverie detached from the process of observing the smallest detail of the physical universe around him and making quick deductions therefrom, it was well concealed. Arriving at the corrals, he was instantly aware of every animal that was within sight or earshot, how much the chickens had grown, what doors were open, what hinges or locks were hanging and in need of repair, whether or not any tools had been left lying on the ground. Gypsy was in her stall and gave a little grunting whinny as her master emptied a can of oats into her feed box. While she ate, he curry-combed and brushed her. "How do you like it, eh? Living the life of Riley like this? No more roughing it out on the range, no more runs with the herd. Well, you deserve it, old girl." He lifted her forelock and wiped her face carefully with a soft cloth. He looked at her teeth, worn down to smooth stubs. "Getting on, baby, aren't you? You and me both. Ain't what we used to be." He began to hum the old grey mare, standing back to look at her. The thoroughbred's head was turned to him, her fine ears sharply pricked, her neck curved. "Gypsy, my hat's off to you. You're still a fine-looking gal, if you are a quarter of a century old. Let's see, is that right?" He slowly took pipe and tobacco from his pocket and filled it as he counted back to his last year at West Point. Gypsy had been 5 years old when he rode her in the polo game between Army and Willowbrook. That was 3 years before his marriage, 4 years before Howard was born, and Howard was 16 now. The facts smote him as if he had not known them. Howard 16! The boy had suddenly begun to shoot up, ankles and wrists out of all his shirts and pants, and just this morning at breakfast they had been in gales of laughter at the way his voice had slipped down now and then to a deep bass. 16! Howard was nearly grown up. Almost a generation had passed since he had bought the ranch and brought Nell there, both of them so full of hope and confidence. And what had he accomplished? Those were the 16 years which were to have established his success and made the future safe for all of them. But they were behind him now, not ahead, and neither success nor safety achieved. That can happen, that a person comes to the end of a chapter and it does not contain those things it ought to. A whole generation, a large section of life gone by, just that section in which big things would have been done, and they were not done. But he had never expected to have it happen to him. He led the mare out, mounted her and rode into the stable pasture, thinking again of Howard. The boy was very bright, a good student, always got high marks. If he got the proper schooling, and at Bostwick's he would, he ought to make West Point in 2 years. Bostwick's. And that reminded him of the $800 he must somehow find before September 10th, and Bellamy, the sheep man. Whatever would he have done without the rent from the sheep? It hadn't seemed anything of importance 3 years ago when he leased grazing rights to Jim Bellamy for his band of 1,500 ewes. They hadn't interfered with the horses. They ate different grass. There had been enough for both, and the 25 tons of hay he sold Bellamy left plenty for the horses and cows. Well, if not plenty, at least enough. Though he had to be a bit tight with it. So, really, it hadn't put him out at any or cost him anything to have the sheep on the place. And here he had come to count on the yearly rental of $1,500, paid promptly twice a year, as the easiest and surest revenue of the ranch. Just suppose he didn't have it. What about sending Howard to school then? What about? His mind gathered up the various items of indebtedness that he and Nell had discussed the evening before. It wasn't pleasant figuring. It never was. He tried to guess at what his summer sales of horses would amount to, but this gave him internal jitters. He had figured so often and been fooled. His sales never amounted to half, not to a third of what he expected. His mind pursued a familiar groove. Should he sell off his geldings that were over 4 years old at the army sale in the fall? If he did, it would be quite some money, but still not half what the animals were worth for polo or hunting. Army paid $185 a head, tops. It really wouldn't pay him back what they had cost him, counting everything. If he kept them, he might make a good sale here or there, but the horses were getting older all the time. Their feed costs money. Worst of all, they needed daily care and riding. Otherwise, they went half wild again, and he hadn't men enough to do it. The mare carried him easily. Taggart had a colt this year, so he was riding Gypsy instead. Besides, he wanted Gypsy in the stable, sheltered and cared for and well fed. She must never have another foal. She was getting too old. He hated the thought of losing her. She had been part of him for so long, even before Nell and the boys. Gypsy and he had been together. She was the link to those carefree cadet days. He and Gypsy had their beginnings together in the East. Perhaps, if it had not been for Gypsy and for the fact that he had been so crazy about her, he would not have abandoned his army career and come west to raise horses. Gypsy was the first foundation mare of his band, and here she was, a quarter of a century old, and still stepping out with that long springing trot, still quick to answer his least word or movement, still eager to take him for a ride whenever he wanted to go. Cantering along the ridge above Castle Rock Meadow, he drew rein to overlook the meadow and calculate the hay crop. It had another month to grow, but it was thick and deep already. If it weren't for the many large flat rocks in that meadow, it would produce 100 tons of hay. He got out his notebook and pencil and did a bit of figuring on the amount of surface those rocks stole from the hay, how much dynamite it would take to blast them away, how many days' work to drill holes for the dynamite and cart away the broken rock. There were also several little draws that ran down into the meadow where he never cut any hay. He fed it out. If he developed those draws, grubbed out the shrubs, blasted out the rocks, drained them, ran irrigation ditches along their sides and put dams up above, there would be many more tons of hay. He put away his notebook and rode on. The hay was a sure income. The hay and the rent money for the sheep. The horses, not sure at all. He ought to be doing everything to develop income from the ranch apart from the horses. Dynamite those rocks, develop those new meadows. But where was the time? The horses took it all. Crossing section number 19, he became aware that the sky was darkening. Looking up, he saw a mass of purple clouds rushing up from the horizon. There seemed several layers of them, moving in different directions. Some queer twisting of winds there, he thought, blowing in several directions at once. He cantered on. If it rained, what matter? He must see Bellamy and ask him if he could pay the first half of the lease money a month before it was due, on September the 1st instead of in October. That would take care of Howard's tuition. The storm gathered. Rob cast a glance at the dark heavens and touched a spur to his mare. They galloped faster. If he could reach Bellamy and his camp before the storm burst, he would save himself a wetting. But suddenly he pulled rein. He felt as if he were in the very core of an electrical storm. Above the ranch hung a canopy of royal purple. The great clouds seemed to be made of plush, as if one could thrust arms into it and feel the fabric. At its far edges, tatters of it hung down in points. Lightning was playing through it. Rob sat still on Gypsy, spellbound at the sight. As often as he had seen such spectacles on the ranch, they still were awe-inspiring. A spear of lightning stabbed into the earth not far from him, then another and another. The fence, some distance away, caught one of those spears and it ran along the wire in liquid flame. All around him the bolts of fire were falling. Appalled at the danger he was in, he ended the mare, and thinking of the pieces of metal in bridle and saddle, he dismounted quickly, stripped the mare, laid the stuff on the earth at a distance, and mounted Gypsy again with just a rope twisted around her nose. He rode on towards Bellamy's camp. The cloud changed from purple to blue-black. There was first the rumble of thunder, then a crash. Then, following the lightning bolts, ear-splitting cracks and explosions. They shattered the cloud. It opened and poured forth floods, and there was no more lightning. All the electricity was carried off in the rain, and Rob remembered that he had read somewhere that lightning, when it strikes the earth, plants nitrogen there. That meadow he had been riding across must be rich with nitrogen then. The storm ended, as suddenly it had begun. The sun came out and Rob's drenched shirt began to steam. Presently he heard the sound of the sheep, the deep, stuttering bars of the ewes, and the bleating of the lambs, like children crying. Coming to the crest of a ridge, he saw the band spread out in the valley below him, and drew rein a moment to look at them. With one of those sudden impulses which animate all the lambs of a band at the same moment, the desire to nurse came upon them. They abandoned their pasture on the slopes of the valley, and one and all, bleating like sick children, rushed for their mothers. The mothers appeared to share in this unreasonable sense of crisis. They looked up from their grazing and bowed frantically, running to meet the lambs. It was bedlam. When mother and child met, and it seemed miraculous that they could recognize each other, the lambs fell on their knees, thrust up their heads, and nursed violently, butting, making gluttonous, gurgling sounds. Continuing on his way, Rob rounded a bend and saw Bellamy at a distance. He was sitting on a rock, watching his sheep. Near him were two black shepherd dogs, which set up a barking at sight of Rob, then ran to meet him. Bellamy was a small man with a shy, bearded face. As he came to greet Rob, still wearing his loose white slicker, Rob thought, as he often had before, that he looked like an Arab. Rob dismounted and sat down for a chat. Bellamy, starved for companionship and talk, rattled away at such a pace that Rob could hardly follow him. Puffing contentedly at his pipe, Rob listened and watched the movements of the sheep below in the valley, estimating the value of the band. 1,500 ewes, at present prices, worth $7,500. Quite a property. Bellamy had acquired the foundation ewes of his herd in the days of the Depression, when sheep were being sold for $1 or 50 cents a head, or were even being given away or turned loose on the prairies. No one had money to pay herders or taxes or to buy feed. For some years following that, he had made a good salary herding and had put it all into sheep. The sheep were in fine condition. Rob ran his eye over the grass. Plenty of sage on the hillside. Pointing at it, he said, "Good grazing for sheep, isn't it?" "Couldn't be nothing better," said Bellamy. "This ranch has got everything. Shelter, feed, water, and that creek down there," he pointed with his dirty hand in a northerly direction. "There's something in that water they likes. They goes nuts about it. When they gets a sniff of it, they starts running. When they gets to the water, they piles on top of each other to drink it." "That's curious," said Rob. "Must be some mineral in it they need. I'll have it analysed some time." Bellamy gave a sharp exclamation. He was staring across the valley. Suddenly, with a stream of profanity, he leaped up, grabbed his rifle, and took aim. Rob saw a disturbance among the sheep. There was the crack of the rifle, then a slinking grey form ran out. Bellamy shot again. The coyote leapt in the air and fell dead. The two men walked down to look at it, Bellamy talking excitedly of the number of coyotes he had shot that summer, of the half-dozen or so lambs he had lost. He shoved at the grey corpse with his foot and pointed proudly to a round, bleeding hole in the head. Got him right in the middle. The dead lamb lay nearby. They carried both corpses up to the sheep wagon. Bellamy took out a sharp skinning knife. "I'll help you if you've got another knife," said Rob. They removed the pelts. Bellamy tossed the coyote to the dogs. "And this will make stew for me," he said, pointing to the lamb. "I'll sell the pelts." "By the way, Jim," said Rob, "I suppose you'll want another lease this fall?" A light sprang into Bellamy's eyes. "No, sirree," he said proudly. "I'm a-getting a ranch of my own." Rob pulled at his pipe in silence. It was amazing that he should experience such a sinking sensation just because he wasn't going to have this lease again. "Have your own ranch, Jim? That's pretty nice. Have you bought it already?" He laughed in a loud, kidding manner. And if so, what did you use for money? When you came here 3 years ago, you told me the ewes were the only thing you owned in the world. He turned his head around to look at the man with his eyes that were narrow blue slits in his dark face. His heavy jaw was thrust forward pugnaciously, and his white teeth bit hard on the stem of his pipe. Bellamy was eager to tell. It's the sheep. I've been getting good prices these 3 years, and herding 'em myself. I've got no overhead but what I pays to you, and the cotton cake and corn I buys for the sheep, and a little extra help at lambing time, and the shearing. Rob figured slowly. Well, you pay me 1,500 and 200 more for the 25 tons of hay I sell you, and how many tons of feed for the sheep? 3, about $40 a ton. Bellamy had it all figured out. The corn and cotton cake last year cost me 200, and oats for my wagon team another 50. That's nearly 2,000 already, said Rob. That's right, and then some extra salt for the sheep, my own grub, 2 extra men at lambing time, call it another 500, and all the rest's profit. All the rest? Rob took a long pull on his pipe and blew the smoke out slowly while he figured. Bellamy's yearly expenses had come to a good $2,500. All the rest was profit, you say? Bellamy had a soiled piece of paper in his hand and a pencil, and was excitedly jotting down figures. And what Rob got now was the other side of the account, the income. First, the price of wool, at 23 cents a pound minus the 2.5 cents a pound to the shearers, the ewes averaging 10 pounds of wool apiece, 1,500 ewes, that came to a little over $3,000. And the lamb crop, at the end of the summer, even with deductions for losses in shipping and commissions, over 4 times that. Rob rode away from the sheep camp, so shaken with conflicting emotions that rational thought was an impossibility. An income of over $10,000 yearly? That illiterate Bedouin? He can go out and make $10,000. I can work like a dog over my horses and breed good ones, and not make enough to buy their oats. What's the use? I suppose it's because I'm producing a luxury and he's producing a necessity. I might as well cut my throat. I must get my one-track mind from Ken. But sheep, gah! I'd rather raise rabbits. His legs tightened convulsively and Gypsy leaped forward. He rode furiously. The sight of his saddle reposing on the turf pulled him up. He dismounted, saddled and bridled his mare, and continued on his way. His thoughts kept pace with him. But it's luck too, he muttered. That fellow has had the luck of the very devil. A lot of sheepmen have gone bust. Here's Gaynor, up on the hill. Scab got in his herd. He threw good money after bad, $30,000 he told me, until everything he had was gone. He wouldn't touch the sheep business again. Gypsy felt the spur. There is such a thing as luck. Some fellows have it, I haven't, never did have. What shall I tell Nell? He rode into the corral, unsaddled and fed his mare, turned her out and strode down to the house. He saw no one. As he entered the front door, the emptiness of the house hit him. He was glad of it. His clothes were still wet. He went upstairs, took a shower and put on flannels and a blue shirt. Looking at himself in the mirror, as he brushed his hair, he saw reddish spots on his face, almost like bruises. He was glad Nell wasn't there to see them. He went downstairs, took a bottle and glass from the sideboard and carried it to his desk. Seated comfortably there, drinking his highball, he began to feel better. He poured himself another. Looking around, he saw a white envelope on the floor near the screen door and went to get it. An open safety pin was stuck in it. Nell's handwriting on it and his name. It had fallen from the screen door, no doubt. He opened and read it. Hello, darling. Charlie Sargent came over and, as you weren't here, the boys got him to go down to their track and see Thunderhead run. I'm going too. It's because Charlie is racing some 2-year-olds at the Saginaw Falls race tracks in Idaho this fall. If Thunderhead's good enough, he might go too. If you get this note in time, come on down to the track and see the fun. Anyway, I'll bring Charlie home to supper. Please put some coal in the kitchen stove. I might be late. Here's hoping. Rah for Thunderhead. Nell. Rob read this note several times and for some reason or other found himself getting angrier. Ken and Thunderhead. Ken always creating a commotion. Nell and Charlie down there watching the colt run. They'd be sympathising with Ken too in his grief about the fact that Thunderhead would have to be gelded with the other two 2-year-olds. Well, that's one thing I won't give in on. Not by a sight. He poured himself another drink and was surprised when he looked at the bottle to see how little whiskey was left. He leaned comfortably back in his chair and tilted the glass to his lips. Over the rim of it he saw Gus through the window, driving the 2 black mares in the light wagon up to the stables. While he finished the drink, a little pattern was forming in his mind. Those 2 black mares, a fine fast team, the racetrack, an audience, some competition for Thunderhead, and suddenly all his depression vanished. He finished his drink at a gulp and jumped up. The chair went over as he did so. He went striding through the house, up to the stables, calling for Tim and Gus. No, don't turn the mares out, Gus. Give them some more oats and the best grooming they ever had in their lives. I want them to shine. Tim, give me a hand with this trailer. I want to drag it down to the tool shop. Bring that old wagon tongue. Working furiously, Rob and Tim attached the wagon tongue with a couple of bolts to the trailer hitch. Then Rob took the spring seat out of the wagon and set it across the trailer. Gus brought the mares and harnessed them in. Rob climbed into the seat, took the long whip from Tim and said, "Get up." The mares started forward. Startled at the lightness of the trailer, when they were accustomed to the wagon, they halted and turned their heads around questioningly. No weight to pull, no rattling and banging of the wagon. What was this anyhow? Rob gave a yell and waved the whip. Whoopee! Atta girls, go to it! His outstretched arms flapped the reins. Patsy and Topsy leaped. The little trailer on its rubber wheels bounded after them. Tim and Gus stood watching with broad grins on their faces, while the odd-looking contraption whirled down the road and disappeared around the bend. It's the end of chapter 19.